I will share the screen to put the Shiny app up. Share. All right, so we've got our Shiny app, and I will shift my Zoom screen over there. All right, Charles, tell us what we're looking at first, and then tell me what you want me to do.
Okay, so this is quite abstract, but this is a theoretical exercise. And I've made a few simplifying moves here. So this is to get a qualitative sense of what's going on. Don't use this to predict actual response or predicted response to selection. That's not going to work out. So I got a plot on the right of two traits, trait X and trait Y. I went crazy with the labels, just really, really out there.
Such unique and creative names, Charles. Yes.
Yes. Yes. And there are actually, and each of the individual points is an individual in that scatter plot. And one of the simplifying assumptions we're doing right now is we're just saying there's no environmental variation. So all of the differences you see there are attributable to genetic differences in the context in which these organisms grew. And we're assuming that, we don't have to worry about any of the complications that you actually have to worry about in the world. There is a blue arrow that you see there, and that is the response to selection. And but there's also another arrow that's directly underneath it called the selection gradient. Well, that'll become apparent quickly. Now, you'll note that, on the left, there are a series of sliders, and each of these corresponds to some quantity that we can vary that is important for understanding the response to selection. Beta X and beta Y are the selection gradients. So these are ways of relating an individual characteristic uniquely to fitness. So these are like partial regression coefficients. You could edit that part out if you want. Now, then we've got the variational properties. The genetic variance of X, the genetic variance of Y, and that's just the traits there. And when we start messing around with those, it'll become apparent what that means in a more visual way. And then we have the genetic correlation of the two traits, like I described in the podcast part, where if you look at height and reach in humans in a population, they're correlated with one another, genetically speaking, and that's because of pleiotropy affecting both arm length and leg length for the most part. Okay, so what I would like you to do, Professor Achenbach, is to take, let's go to the variance, and how about we decrease the genetic variance of X down to 0.5, 0.4, something like that. Bang. Okay. Maybe just a little bit more.
Go down more, you mean?
Yeah. Okay. So now the gray arrow is apparent. And that's the selection gradient. So the direction in which selection is acting, which is why we call it directional selection. It's favoring things in that direction as a linear function. That stayed the same. We haven't changed the orientation or the length of that particular vector. Now, if you look at the blue arrow, however, that is the response to selection, and that's telling you where the mean of the population is going to be in the next generation. So we scooch a little bit. Now, you'll notice that we scooch quite a bit more on the y-axis than we do on the x-axis. Okay, so how about you set x back to 1 and try the same thing with y, if you would, please. So take it down to 0.2. Let's really bang. All right, so we haven't messed around with the direction in which selection is pointing.
Mm-hmm.
but we have gotten a very different response.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, there is very, very little response in Y
Mm-hmm.
and quite a bit of response in X. All right, so what's going on here? Well, this is saying that the response to selection is a function of both natural selection itself,
Mm-hmm.
and that is the gray arrow, um, and the variational properties that are in the population itself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so would you please take the Y variance back up to 1 or so? And would you mind setting the genetic correlation of X and Y to some absurdly high value, 0.8 or something like that? All right. So look at that there.
Hmm.
This is kind of interesting. The gray arrow hasn't changed. We haven't messed around at all with what natural selection is doing. We've only
Mm-hmm.
tightened up the correlation between the characteristics. So I'm going to use correlation and covariance a little bit loosely here, interchangeably. Just they're different ways of describing the way that things vary together.
Mm-hmm.
Now you'll notice that the response to selection is just shot way up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's right in line with the direction of selection, but it's quite a bit farther along. And that's because we have selection acting on both characteristics, but since they're correlated with one another,
Mm-hmm.
they get a boost from
Mm-hmm.
the indirect response. You change one, the other's going to change as well.
Mm-hmm.
This because the selection gradient is pointing along that axis of the most variation. So if you look at that ellipse, there's kind of a major axis that goes from point to point, more or less on a 45-degree angle there. You can think of that as a principal component.
Mm-hmm.
Then you get the benefit of not only the selection that's acting on the one characteristic, but
Mm-hmm.
a correlated response from selection acting on the other one.
Mm.
Okay. Now, let's make this weird.
It isn't already. It's you and I doing a podcast, Charles. Weird comes with the territory.
I have not yet begun to befuddle. Would you mind setting the beta for X up to 3, say? All right. And then please set the beta for Y to negative 0.5.
Come on. There you go.
Mhm. All right. So what's natural selection doing?
Not what
It's
we would
selecting
expect.
to increase X. So, so let's just focus on the gray arrow for the moment. So that is indicating that there is strong selection to increase X and less selection to decrease Y.
Mm.
All right, but, appreciable, noticeable. And you'll notice that because they're so highly correlated, that the correlated response really predominates.
Mm-hmm.
It's really just shooting up there.
Yeah.
So that is an instance where you are not getting a response in the direction of selection. And so if you were to interpret the blue arrow, that response, let's say you knew that part,
Mm-hmm.
if you were to interpret that as how natural selection was acting to impart that evolution, without worrying about the variational considerations, you'd be led far astray.
Mm. Absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the extent, sort of the point that I wanted to make with this, but
Yeah.
no.
And so would you recommend
Yeah.
that folks can use this kind of thing in class as a demonstration, for example?
Yeah, sure.
Right.
I'm going to fiddle with it as we go forward. And I probably should do the responsible thing and write something up so that
some instructions.
yeah.
Some instructions. But great. No, I think this is actually a really powerful thing to be able to visualize how correlated traits are going to respond with varying degrees of selection. So now I'm going to stop the share screen, and to our producers and to our listeners, you're going to want to return to the podcast after watching that wonderful YouTube video.